From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power with David Westin.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. At the top of the news agenda today are the central banks, with the ECB earlier staying the course pretty much on monetary policy, and the markets in the United States continuing to key off of what they expect next from the Fed early next month. Bloomberg International Economics and Policy correspondent Mike McKee has just talked a short time ago with a key member of the New York Fed. He is the New York Fed president, John Williams, and welcome Mike now. So, Mike, what did you learn from Mr. Williams?
I think he has joined the essentially rest of the Fed in feeling that something needs to be done perhaps a little more quickly and a little more firmly because inflation has gone higher than they anticipated. Here's what he had to say.
The economy is strong. The labor market is basically back to close to where it was before the pandemic, with the unemployment rate around 3.5% and other indicators showing that we have very strong demand for labor. So I do think from a monetary policy point of view, it does make sense for us to move expeditiously towards more normal levels of the federal funds rate and also to move forward on our balance sheet reduction plans.
The key question, though, is what is a more normal Fed funds rate? And he said he thought they'd need to go a little above neutral, which he still pegs at 2 to 2.5%. He's not buying the 4 to 6% range. He noted that the economy is still very strong, as he said there, and there are a lot of job openings, so maybe unemployment doesn't have to rise. But he also saw the retail sales figures as suggesting maybe we're slowing down demand a little bit.
But does he really think we can get inflation down meaningfully from the really remarkable level it is right now without increasing unemployment? Because historically, I'm not sure that's ever happened.
No, I can't find an instance in which that's happened, but he doesn't seem to think that it has to go up. He didn't rule out any rise, but he noted one of the strengths of this economy is there are still so many jobs available that the people can get other jobs if demand starts to tighten and some people get laid off.
So Madame Lagarde, the president of the ECB, of course, had a news conference earlier today, and she said, the EU's economy is a bit different from the United States. They sort of stayed the course. What did we learn from the ECB?
Well, it was interesting because there have been a couple developments. The first thing, their statement was all about the Ukraine war and the stresses it's putting on the European economy and how that's led to downside risks. And so they just basically kept their current policy of no change in interest rates and continued bond buying at least for the next couple of months. And then they said maybe in the third quarter we will end the bond buying, and after that we could raise rates. Then just a few moments ago, Bloomberg News reporting out of Europe that there's a consensus building on the ECB, which she didn't talk about, for a 25 basis point move in the third quarter once they finish with the balance sheet. After the Lagarde news conference, the euro took a big hit. And this may be the ECB pushing back in a way, saying, don't write us off yet. We've got a tough job to do, and it's not easy to thread that needle.
A leak, but maybe a strategic leak, as it were, which has been known to happen. Thank you so much to Michael McKee from Bloomberg. And now we want to turn to one of our very favorite analysts when it comes to the economy. He's Stephen Stanley, Amherst Pierpont chief economist. So, Stephen, thank you for being with us. We've had a fair number of U.S. eco data this week. We got the retail sales numbers just today. We had those, to some people, alarming CPI numbers. Where's the economy right now?
Oh, it's great to be with you. The economy is still strong, as President Williams said. I think you've still got demand that's exceeding supply in the economy, and so that's leading in the labor market. It's leading to wage pressures in the goods and services market. It's leading to price pressures, and maybe the heat is going to dial down a little bit as the year progresses. But I still think that's what the Fed is working against. Is they need to get to a policy that's not stoking the fire even further.
So help me a little bit, as not an economist, Stephen. In an atmosphere like this, how do you separate out the nominal from the real? Because you can talk about growth, but how much of that is inflation? Just the dollars are bigger because of inflation.
No, it's tough. I mean, definitely the retail sales numbers, you have that issue. For example, grocery store sales were up 1% in March, which sounds like a really big gain. But when you consider that's about how fast grocery prices are rising, so people aren't necessarily buying a lot more volumes of food. They're just having to pay more for it. Obviously, gasoline prices are even much more volatile than that, and that's having a huge impact on the nominal numbers as well. So it is an issue. I mean, there are things you can look at. You can look at industrial production, which is in real terms for manufacturing. You can look at employment, which is a body count, not affected necessarily by inflation. So there are things that economists do look at, but it certainly makes it a little bit different than what we've been used to the last few decades.
Stephen, one of the reasons I really love reading your notes whenever they come out, and they come out quite regularly, I'll say, is that you go beyond what the numbers say, and you say, well, I think that number actually is exaggerated a bit one way or the other. Maybe it's a little too negative, a little too positive. Do you have a sense right now of when inflation might be peaking?
Well, if we're talking about the year-over-year numbers, they probably peaked in March. But unfortunately, a big reason for that is because the inflation readings last spring were very high. That was kind of the reopening phase, and when we had these huge increases in airfares and hotel rates and car prices and just a handful of categories back when the Fed was talking about inflation being transitory. So as those numbers roll out of the 12-month window, the year-over-year numbers are going to go down. But I think we're going to have to also focus on the monthly readings. And we did see a lower core CPI reading this week, but it was driven almost entirely by used car prices falling. And that is one small part of the economy right now where we are seeing relief on the price front. But unfortunately, those upward price pressures are still very broad across a wide array of categories. So I'm watching those month-to-month numbers in particular. I think they're probably more important for us than the year-over-year numbers, which are, of course, impacted by what was going on a year ago.
And what about housing prices? Because my understanding is they tend to lag a bit, and they also tend to be a bit stickier.
Yeah, the housing components of the CPI, some academic research suggests that it lags the home price readings by about 18 months. And the home price readings haven't even started to slow down yet. So I think we've got a long way to go before we see relief on that front in the CPI. And of course, that's by far the biggest part of core CPI. It represents shelter costs represent about 40% of the core CPI. So that's, as long as that category is posting big gains, it's going to be tough to get the core CPI down by very much.
Various members of the FOMC are saying rate increases are coming. There was a small down payment last time, but it wasn't that big. We had Mr. Williams, John Williams of the New York Fed, say that again to Mike McKee today. It's coming. What do you think the economy can withstand in terms of rate increases between now and the end of the year?
Right. So if we use the Fed's formulation, they'd like to talk about a neutral funds rate. And a neutral funds rate is a rate that is neither stimulating nor restricting the economy. And most Fed officials put that between 2.25 and 2.5. So about 200 basis points away from the current setting. And when you think of it in those terms, you can understand why the Fed is kind of scrambling at this point and talking about getting rates up, as President Williams said, in an expeditious manner. I think, my expectation is that they're going to want to get rates up to around that, what they view as the neutral level by the end of this year. So that implies about 200 basis points of rate hikes over the rest of the year. Now, that sounds really bad and harmful for the economy, but the reality is that's pretty much already priced into the markets. And so it doesn't necessarily, we've seen a run up in interest rates already. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to see a huge contraction or a big slowing in the economy necessarily. I think the economy's got enough momentum that it's likely to continue to perform well on the way up to neutral.
So that's pretty reassuring. But let me ask you, what if, in fact, the neutral rate isn't at 2 or 2.5%? Because as I understand, it's not written on tablets of stone. You don't get told what the neutral rate is. Right. And some people think it may be north of there.
Yeah, I think it might be a little higher than what the Fed thinks. The reality is that phase 2 of the rate hike cycle, which is likely to be 2023's main story, is going to be taking rates above neutral. And President Williams talked about that. Others have as well. And I think the Fed's going to be very careful there. They're going to move once they get to neutral. If inflation is not where they'd like it to be, which I don't think it will be, they'll keep going. They'll move 25. They'll wait and see how that plays out, move 25 again if they need to, and just keep moving in an incremental fashion until they get inflation under control. Unfortunately, my view is that it's going to take higher rates than what's priced into the market and what the consensus is on the FOMC right now. I think the FOMC is hopeful that just a few ticks above neutral would be enough to get the job done. And I think, in my view, it's probably going to take a little more than that, because inflation has got a lot of momentum. They waited a little too long to get going, and they've allowed the inflation genie, at least partially, out of the bottle. And so it's going to take some work on their part to get it back in.
Stephen, last question. As you know, real interest rates have been negative for quite some time, sometimes deeply negative. There are economists, I talked to Larry Summers earlier today, who said we're not going to really get our arms around inflation until we get those into positive territory. Is that realistic by the end of the year?
Probably not. I mean, again, if the Fed's really aggressive, they can get back to something close to neutral. They can get into the low twos. That's about, you're starting to get close to a point where real rates are back to zero. They've been, strongly negative for a long time. But yeah, I don't think the I don't think the Fed is going to be moving into restrictive territory for sure until next year at the earliest.
Okay, thank you so much. Always great to have you with us, Stephen. That's Stephen Stanley. He's Amherst Pierpont chief economist. We have some breaking news now just coming across the terminal, and that is it's reported that President Biden is making a decision about whether to send a senior American official to Kyiv, to Ukraine. We know this has been talked about for some time. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, earlier today was asked about it, said we're not sure yet. We've had other heads of state go Kyiv, but now President Biden is making a decision about whether to send a senior official. By the way, notice I didn't say send the President of the United States, because the talk is he's not going to send President Biden, but we'll see. Meantime, coming up here, the countdown to a major battle in eastern Ukraine. We talk with the former commander of the U.S. Army in Europe, retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We want to keep you up to date on news from around the world, and for that we turn to Mark Crumpton here with the first word.
David, thank you. The Vatican's decision to put a Ukrainian and a Russian side by side during a Good Friday celebration is criticized for equating victims to their aggressors. Ukraine's top Catholic cleric called the move untimely and ambiguous. Bloomberg has learned Ukrainians working within the Vatican were disconcerted by the plan. An internal Vatican briefing also mentioned possible protests during the Stations of the Cross celebration Friday in Rome, which Pope Francis is due to lead. South Africa declares the floods that killed more than 300 people in the eastern KwaZulu-Natal province a disaster, enabling the government to free up funds to assist with reconstruction in the area. This week, the heaviest rainfall in 6 decades caused landslides, interrupted port operations, damaged roads, and washed away houses. At least 306 people were killed. More rain is forecast in eastern South Africa this weekend. Residents in New York City's more than 3,000 buildings, including the city's fanciest high-rises, may have to take out their own trash. This comes after their workers authorized their union to call a strike and contract talks break down. Doormen, superintendents, and other employees authorized their bargaining committee to call a strike if they don't reach a collective bargaining agreement by April 20th. Russia is threatening to deploy nuclear weapons in the Baltic Sea region if Finland and Sweden join NATO. After decades of staying out of the alliance, both countries said they are considering the move in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia says it hopes that reason will prevail. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Mark. I want to stay on that subject of Russia-Ukraine, with all reports now being that Ukraine and Russia are preparing for what could be a massive land battle out in the eastern part of Ukraine. To take us through what may come next in this war, we welcome retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, who served as the Commanding General, U.S. Army Europe. He now holds the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy Analysis. So, General, thank you so much for being with us. First of all, let's start with some of the big news overnight, at least on the military front, which is apparently the damaging of the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. It's the Moskva. What do you make of that?
David, this is significant. From a symbolic standpoint, obviously, if you can knock the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet out of the fight. That's going to be quite a boost for the Ukrainians, as well as all of us who are supporting Ukraine. And then from a practical standpoint, the Moskva is a very powerful warship, both in terms of its ability to launch missiles, which they've been doing, murdering Ukrainian civilians in the cities, but also it's a real platform for air and missile defense. So this also puts a hole in Russia's ability to protect itself from Ukrainian missiles.
What might it tell us, General, about the capability of the Ukrainians, that they have a missile perhaps that I guess it's called the Neptune, I've read that at least, that could actually damage a ship of that size. What other capabilities might they have, as we are mindful that the United States is now shipping another $800 million worth of supplies over?
Well, first of all, it's a reminder of how savvy the Ukrainians are. That the Neptune actually is only very recently fielded. So this is not something that they've employed a lot or used a lot of. But the way that they did it, as we're all learning here over the last 24 hours, what happened, and I don't want to go into too much detail about the tactics that they use, just suffice to say, very, very clever, showing a lot of technical savvy as well as maritime wisdom on how they did this. But it also was revealing about the Russians. Their Navy is no more operationally capable than their army, as we're learning. So some of the weaknesses of these Russian ships, Ukrainian sailors were already aware, and I think they were able to exploit that. So I don't know the actual status of the Moskva right now. The last report I heard was that it was being towed in, but I think it's going to be, if it doesn't sink, it's going to be out of the fight for a very long time.
So, General, come back to the reports we're having right now of both sides really getting ready for what could be quite a battle. And talk specifically about May 9, because there are reports that perhaps President Putin might like to have something developed before May 9. That's a time that they have a big commemoration in Moscow of the defeat of Germany in World War II. Is that enough time for the Russians to get ready for a big fight in the East?
Not really, unless they started very early, which would be counter to what we've seen so far. May the 9th, I do believe that May 9th is a big day for them in terms of a milestone because of its symbolism as the commemoration of the end of the Second World War, what the Russians call the Great Patriotic War, huge parade in Red Square every year. It'll be a little bit awkward for them if they don't have something to celebrate this year. And so that's why I think there is immense pressure on the general staff to deliver something that looks like a victory. For sure, they're going to continue to crush everybody in Donbass that they can. Mariupol has been such an amazing story of heroic resistance. I don't know the exact status in Mariupol. Again, mixed reports there. But I think there's going to be an attempt to deliver something that looks really significant before May the 9th. However, the reconstitution effort to rebuild the units that were so badly damaged in these last 7 weeks, this is a lot of logistical effort, repairing vehicles, replacing leaders, building up ammunition and fuel. So it's a very vulnerable time for the Russians, and I hope that we are helping Ukraine find ways to disrupt this reconstitution effort.
General, finally, give us some brief sense, at least, of what you think are the longer-term strategic significance for U.S. forces in Europe, and, by the way, for NATO, of course, in response to this war. However it develops, however it comes out, how do we need to rethink the way we deploy our forces over there?
Well, I think we're going to probably see some permanent basing in Romania, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And I didn't think that was a good idea a few years ago. Obviously, I was wrong. I've changed my assessment now. Don't need a lot, but having what we call enablers, logisticians, air and missile defense, headquarters, those kinds of things, getting that in place, which would facilitate rapid reinforcement if there was a crisis, but would also help facilitate the employment of our allies' forces along NATO's eastern flank. So I think this is going to be one of the key developments, a recognition that we don't get to choose China or Russia, but that we have to be prepared to deal with all of these threats.
General, it's really a great privilege to have you with us. Thank you for your time. That's retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. Coming up, Elon Musk's bid to buy Twitter. What comes next? This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We want to check in on the markets, and particularly tech, because it's really been taking a beating this week, apparently because of those yields on the 10-year. We turn now to our colleague, Ed Ludlow. So, Ed, thanks so much for being with us from San Francisco. What is going on with tech? People don't love it right now.
Yeah, two sides to the story, really. I mean, we're off 0.7% on the S&P 500 with information technology, communications, the worst performing sector. And we heard really Fed speak, right? New York Fed President John Williams saying that the pace of tightening or the outlook for rate hikes could be sped up with 0.5 or half percentage points. And you see there a spike in yields, US 10-year yield at 2.8% after a few days of kind of retracting a little bit. But then you look at some of the specific movers, the points movers on the NASDAQ 100 and S&P 500. Tesla, one of the big points laggards. And of course, that is a very specific story tied to Elon Musk and Twitter, David.
Well, I was hoping you'd take it to Elon Musk. It wouldn't be fun if we didn't go there. So tell us about this hostile takeover bid. I feel like I'm back in the 80s.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost unprecedented, Dave. I don't know if you remember a time that an individual, not an institution or an entity, but an individual said they'd write a check for $43 billion. But Elon Musk is offering $54.20 in an all-cash deal for Twitter. It's conditional on financing, he says, and it's his final offer, he says. And, you know, the reason I brought up Tesla as well as Twitter shares higher, Tesla softer, is one of the hypotheses from the street is that Elon Musk might have to liquidate some of his Tesla holdings in order to finance that deal. You know, we don't know the specifics, but we do know that Twitter is considering it.
Yeah, he's worth $270 billion, but that's not in cash. Let's be clear about that. He doesn't have that sitting around in cash. But I noticed that actually the stock is trading significantly below what his offer was. Does that mean the street doesn't quite believe it?
Well, actually, you know, just looking at my Bloomberg, we're now flat and just kind of dipping into negative territory on Twitter, down 0.4%. I mean, the other hypothesis from the street is that Elon Musk is basically outlining in the regulatory filing that this is a final and generous offer. You know, there's a premium to where shares are trading. We're at around $45 a share right now. But it was only a year ago that Twitter was trading at $70 to $75 a share. And so there is a feeling among sell-side analysts in particular that this is a lowball offer and that he will, despite what he said in the filing, come back with a higher offer at some point.
And in the meantime, we're going to hear from Elon Musk. As I understand, there's a TED Talk coming up in a few minutes.
TED Talk coming up at 12:45 Eastern Time from Vancouver, and we're told that we're in for a surprise.
We'd be disappointed if he didn't surprise us, I think, at this point.
Quite.
Thank you so much to Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow. Coming up, keeping the homeland safe in the wake of attacks like that in Brooklyn this week. We talk with former Secretary of Homeland Security, Jeh Johnson. This is Balance of Power, and we are on Bloomberg Television, and we are on Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We want to keep you up to date with news from around the world. For that, we turn to Mark Crumpton with the first word.
David, thank you. Russia may roll back more of the capital controls imposed to stabilize markets after its invasion of Ukraine, now into its 50th day. President Biden announced $800 million in additional U.S. military aid for Ukraine, and the European Union agreed to provide more cash for weapons. Meantime, Moscow says the warship Moskva will be towed back to port after a fire. Ukraine's armed forces said the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet was hit by anti-ship missiles. Russian President Vladimir Putin says Europe has no alternative to Russian gas supplies, and any attempt to wean off those deliveries will have massive negative consequences for the continent's economy. The warning comes as European companies and governments are weighing how to respond to an order from Mr. Putin to start paying for their gas in rubles. They risk a cutoff in supplies if they don't comply. The European Union says that to give in to Putin, countries would be violating sanctions imposed after the invasion of Ukraine. Almost 2 months into China's worst COVID outbreak, it has reported only 2 deaths, a striking number that's the subject of growing debate because it appears to beat even nations with higher vaccination rates. The deaths both occurred in the northeastern province of Jilin, while financial hub Shanghai, now the epicenter of the country's outbreak, reported a record of almost 28,000 new cases. The city's 25 million residents have been locked down for several weeks. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says he plans to send asylum seekers who cross the English Channel to Rwanda. The Prime Minister expects it will face significant legal hurdles. In a speech today, Mr. Johnson said migrants who come to Britain on small boats risk being sent to the African state. The plan is designed to deter people from making the dangerous crossing. Last year, about 28,000 people did. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, of course, the city of New York was racked earlier this week with that shooting in a crowded subway in Brooklyn. And now they have a suspect who's been apprehended. I think he's appearing in court any moment now, actually, reportedly to be charged, among other things, with terrorism. But let's be honest, this is not the only such attack in urban centers around the United States these days. And we welcome now somebody who really has focused on this issue, Homeland Security, and specifically issues of domestic terrorism. He's Jeh Johnson of Paul Weiss. He's the former Secretary of Homeland Security and former General Counsel of the Department of Defense. So, Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for being back with us. As I say, this was a horrible instance, but we'd be remiss if we acted like it was unique. It's not unique at all. Give us a sense of about the level of danger for us living in cities in the United States these days and what can be done about it.
Couple thoughts, David. One, I have to say, when I was in office as Secretary of Homeland Security, an attack on mass transit, on a subway station, a train station, commuter rail, was probably one of the things that I feared most. Through a lot of good police work, a lot of good intelligence, a lot of good detective work, investigative work, we managed to avoid that for a very, very long time. The attack on Tuesday, frankly, is a reminder of many things, including the importance of grants that the Department of Homeland Security gives to cities and states for things like surveillance cameras.
Well, what about the surveillance cameras? Now we're told there were surveillance cameras, but they weren't working.
Yes, turns out that apparently the surveillance camera at the 36th Street station of the N and the R and the D were not working, which is why we didn't have this fella on surveillance cameras immediately. I did, however, predict on Tuesday that by Thursday this guy will have been caught. The largest point I'd like to make here, David, is as New Yorkers, we're resilient people. I ride the subways almost every day to work. I rode the subway this morning. Lots of other people were on the subway. We will get past this incident, and it was an incident. It was a very serious incident. The individual is being brought to justice as we speak, and we move on.
Does it make us safer to call it terrorism? I get confused, frankly, about what is terrorism and what isn't terrorism.
Technically, now I'm going back to my prosecutor days, this individual has been charged with a violation of 18 U.S.C. 1992, you're a lawyer, which punishes up to life in prison an act of violence on mass transit, not necessarily an act of terrorism. Whether it's terrorism or not depends upon the mind and the motive of the assailant. There's a lot of rants on social media. Whether or not it's considered an act of terrorism, he's being punished to the maximum extent of federal law, it appears.
And specifically focusing on the mass transit. That's a very interesting fact. Yes. Let me go to a different issue, but related to what you did at Homeland Security, and that's our southern border with Mexico. We now have a governor in Texas who, as I understand, has decided to have his own system of inspecting trucks as they come across the border. I guess because he thinks the federal people are not doing a good enough job. But it's reportedly slowing down commerce. Can he do that?
In theory, yes. I look at that and I view it as sort of a costly political stunt that backfired. Immigration, border security, port security is the province of the federal government. Every once in a while, governors want to get involved by, here, take my National Guard. And very often the response is to do what? They can't engage in law enforcement on the border. And so it is the exclusive province of, not the exclusive province necessarily, there's legal fights over that, but it's the principal province of the federal government. this incident is a reminder that our borders are there to secure, but our borders are also important for lawful trade and travel. We are Mexico's #1 trade partner, and they are our #3 trade partner. And so when you have something like this, a backlog coupled with protest, you see the ripple effect. And there are going to be a lot of angry consumers, I suspect, because of this one incident.
Before you were Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, you spent a fair amount of time at the Department of Defense.
Yes.
There's a war going on in Ukraine, goodness knows. What do you make of that? What do you think is going on? What are the issues we should be watching?
I worry that this may end up in some sort of stalemate where Putin somehow occupies a portion of the country. Neither side declares victory, neither side declares defeat, and there's a tense standoff of sorts punctuated by acts of violence here or there. The Ukrainian military, the Ukrainian people have performed remarkably against a much larger enemy force. And I continue to believe that Vladimir Putin's soft underbelly is public opinion in Russia. There's state-owned TV, which is largely filtered. But then there's social media. There's a lot of misinformation on social media, but there's a lot of truth that is actually filtering through on social media in Russia if the Russian people take the time to look for it. And that could have a huge impact on public opinion. More and more Russians will understand exactly what their government is doing, the atrocities, the war crimes being committed in Ukraine. And I think that is actually a rising tide against Vladimir Putin.
I hope I'm wrong, but I think we have to anticipate the possibility that things will get worse. That the scenes we'll see coming out of places like Mariupol and other Mariupols will be more difficult to really tolerate. Yeah. How disciplined are we in the United States and with NATO to restrain ourselves? Because there will be a temptation to take a more active role.
That's a very good question. Far too often in our history, we have stumbled into armed conflict inch by inch without fully intending to do so, without a clear picture of what our objectives are. The reality is it's easier, David, to get into an armed conflict than it is to extract yourself from one. From what I can see, the Biden administration, the president has been very disciplined about not crossing certain lines that would put us in direct conflict with Russia. Airstrikes, for example, a no-fly zone, which effectively puts you in direct conflict with Russia. We've been, I think, pretty disciplined about not going across that line. But as images of these atrocities continue to be seen here in this country, there's going to be more and more pressure for us to do more and more by way of supplying weapons, arms, training, and the like.
And finally, let me pull together two things if I can. The discipline on the one hand, but not just in what we do, but in what we say, and what you say is perhaps the vulnerability of President Putin, which is the support of his people. What about discipline in using words like, yes, I'll use the word genocide? Do we have to be careful about that? Does that help us with the Russian people or hurt us?
I was talking to an international law expert on this very question this morning. I understand the impulse to apply harsh rhetoric to what is happening in Ukraine. Technically, legally, I'm not sure the word genocide quite fits. Genocide is a very determined effort to exterminate a race or a nationality of people because of their race or nationality. Clearly, atrocities are being committed in Ukraine. Targeting for death innocent men, women, and children is a war crime. It's an aggravated war crime. I'm not sure I would have called it genocide.
Fair enough.
It's a whole lot of other things.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, reprehensible for sure. That's exactly right. And a war crime, as you say. Thank you so much. Really, always great to have you with us. That's Jeh Johnson of Paul Weiss. Coming up, former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers on remaking the world economic order in the wake of the war in Ukraine. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Earlier today, I talked with Larry Summers of Harvard, the former Treasury Secretary. And of course, we talked about inflation, given those CPI numbers that came out this week. And Larry, of course, is concerned about it, not sure it's going to go away anytime soon.
There's been an effort, as there always is when you have inflation, to dismiss it as due to specific or temporary factors. That is much more wrong than right. You can see it when you take out all the extreme observations in both directions, as that calculation does. You can see it, as I've emphasized, by looking at the wages, which are the ultimate source of costs in the economy. We've got a pretty fundamental inflation problem in our country. You know, David, I saw something recently that brought this home to me. People think of us as having had 13, 14% inflation in the 1970s, but that's only because of the way it was calculated then. If you use the same way we calculate inflation now, it got just above 10% in the 1970s. So getting to 8.5, we're actually closer to being back there than I think most people realize.
So given that, and that's a really interesting fact, I must say, I did not know that. Given that, what should the Fed's realistic goal be right now? I mean, they cannot get it back to 2% by next month, goodness knows.
No, look, I think we need to go back to the old idea of price stability as being when people aren't thinking about inflation as part of regular economic calculations. And we need to move away from the detailed fixation with numerical targets, which it seems to me has led us to unhealthy places. So I'd go back to a general definition of price stability, but we are nowhere close to that right now. And I would worry about the clamor of voices that are saying that, 4% inflation could be okay, or even that inflation above 3 could be okay. I think we need to be very determined to come way down from where we are right now.
Larry, there was a Bank of America survey of fund managers out this week, and the big headline was concerns about stagflation. It's higher than it's been since certainly 2008 or so. How concerned should we be about stagflation?
I think it's the most likely place we're going to be. If stagflation means rising unemployment and still high inflation, I think that's the preponderant probability as to where we're going to get over the last couple of years, over the next couple of years. As I've said before on your show, David, the painful fact that needs to inform our view is that we've never had a moment when unemployment was below 4, inflation was above 4, and we avoided recession for the subsequent 2 years. And right now, unemployment's well below 4, and inflation is well above 4. Lots of people say, look, the job market is so strong, why would anyone think we're going to have a recession? What the data show is that the lower unemployment is, the more likely it is that it's going to turn down in subsequent months.
That was Larry Summers, of course, the former U.S. Treasury Secretary. You can hear more from Larry tomorrow night at 6 p.m. Eastern Time on Wall Street Week, right here on Bloomberg. Coming up, what Elon Musk buying Twitter could mean for the marketplace of ideas with former ACLU President Nadine Strossen. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, the big news, perhaps, of the day is Elon Musk, perhaps no big surprise, saying he wants to buy all of Twitter. We're not sure exactly why he wants to buy it, although sometimes in the past he said he's a little concerned with the policies they've adopted. It's sort of censoring some speech on the site. We turn now to a true expert in the First Amendment and freedom of speech, because this, of course, is freedom of speech. It's not necessarily the First Amendment. Nadine Strossen is professor emerita of New York Law School and former president of the American Civil Liberties Union. So, Professor, thank you so much for being with us. As I say, it's not really First Amendment because that governs the government. This is not the government, but still, it is a free marketplace of ideas. What do you make of this bid by Elon Musk?
Well, first of all, it's great to be on your program, David. And you've already taught a really important lesson that most people don't know, which is we, the public, have no free speech rights at all as a matter of constitutional First Amendment law when it comes to private sector media companies. To the contrary, they have their own free speech rights. And Twitter's policy literally says we can kick you off our platform at any time for any reason or for no reason. Now, I defend their editorial free speech rights, so to say, but it is deeply dangerous for our not only individual liberty and equality of opportunity to participate and contribute to the marketplace of ideas, but this is deeply damaging to our democratic republic when even speech, even by the elected president of the United States at the time, is completely blocked from what the Supreme Court itself has said is definitely the most important forum for the exchange of information among the people and between us and our elected officials.
I have to interrupt us just for one moment because there's a headline that's just crossed the Bloomberg, and that is that the subway shooting suspect, he's Frank James, has now been held without bail. That was a proceeding that was going on at the same time. So thank you, Nadine. I just needed to tell our audience about that. So coming back to this is something I'm very curious about because Elon Musk says he wants a more open approach than Twitter, but let's see if he does get to own it, what he'll do. For example, if somebody wants to start tweeting bad things about him or about Tesla, things that he's interested in, we're not sure whether they'll come out. What about the role of these massive social media forums, actually, I would say, where they really have become almost the public square? Should there be different rules applicable to them?
Well, it really is the worst of both worlds, David. On the one hand, these platforms exercise absolutely unprecedented censorial power. They have, in one single day, one of these companies will delete more communications than all of the governments throughout history all over the world. I'm not exaggerating, just relying on Facebook's quarterly reports, for example. They say just in the category of so-called hate speech alone, they take down hundreds of thousands of posts every single day. So on the one hand, this dwarfs the power of governments. On the other hand, it is not subject to any of the constraints that governments face. There's no First Amendment constraint, there's no due process constraint, there's no electoral or impeachment constraint. And so we really have to look for other tools. Now, that said, I'm really deeply suspicious of various pending laws in Congress that are proposed from both sides of the aisle, because not surprisingly, the Democrats think that certain disinformation should be taken down. It tends to accord with their policy preferences, what the concept of disinformation is, whereas Republicans, as we know, think that fake news is something that not all of us would think is fake news. So it's deeply dangerous to have government step into the fray here. I think it's potentially an encouraging sign that we have somebody who says that he is committed to making this platform the platform where free speech, freedom for diverse ideas and perspectives will be allowed. But why should we trust him? He can change his mind the next day.
So, Nadine, very quickly here at the end, it's the biggest issue. Please come back. We'll discuss it more length. In the end, is it up to us rather than the courts or rather than Congress? Do we get the First Amendment we deserve in the end?
Absolutely right, David. There have been so many pressures to take down more and more controversial information from Democrats, Republicans, conservative, liberals alike. We need to hear more from those of us who are committed to freedom of speech equally for all ideas and all perspectives as essential not only for individual liberty, but for a flourishing democracy.
Okay, thank you so much. It's really great to have you with us, Nadine. That's Nadine Strassen, Professor Emerita of New York Law School and a true First Amendment expert. And now we want to repeat what I said a few minutes ago, which is that New York City subway shooting suspect, his name is Frank James, has now been ordered held without bail. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. And in our second hour, we're going to talk to Dr. Zeke Emanuel of the University of Pennsylvania about where COVID is taking us all. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.